Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Part 2, Chapter 4, Part 2. Subsection 4. "Just come in for a minute," said Enid quietly, as the motor drew up at the door of the flats in Cadogan Lane. "I won't keep you." Neville made a sign of assent. He said nothing. It had been an extraordinarily unpleasant little situation after Enid's complete ignoring of Neville at tea. For a moment, no one had spoken, and then, for perhaps the first time in her life, Mrs. Bessington's conversation had been welcomed. Apparently, she had realized nothing of what was in the air. She had begun in a low, rapid voice to talk about Wall Street, inspired, probably, by the appearance of the American financier in the white waistcoat, who once more was looking round with a pleased smile. Lord Maresfield had joined in with staccato accents, and begun 3 or 4 sentences which he was unable to finish. Algy had slipped away, making a remark about some more sugar cakes, with a selection of which he presently returned. Neville, after an amazed silence, had joined himself, too, onto Mrs. Bessington's subject. Enid, very self-controlled and natural, had continued to dispense tea, and had presently begun to talk quietly to Algy. Lord Maresfield, a few minutes later, had taken his leave, followed by Algy, and immediately after, Enid had said that she supposed they ought to be going, and Neville was coming with them, wasn't he? He had assented. They had gone downstairs together. He had obtained their motor and got in after them. But they had all been silent going home. Enid led the way upstairs, and when the door opened, turned to her mother. "I want to speak to Neville, Mother," she said. "Shall we go into the drawing-room?" Mrs. Bessington murmured something about taking off her things and hurried away. The girl led the way into the drawing-room without looking behind her, and sat down. Neville followed, shut the door, and went across to the hearth. He was completely bewildered. He saw there was something very wrong. He was aware of a sense of strong grievance at the way the girl was treating him, but he could not conceive what it was, exactly, that he had done. He was conscious of nothing deliberate. Had he possibly been brusque? Oh, what on earth was the matter? "Neville, dear," said the girl. He looked up, reassured by her tone. Her eyes were cast down. She was playing with the fringe of her parasol. "Yes?" "You remember our agreement, don't you? You really meant it?" "Why, of course I did," he burst out, more reassured than ever. "Have I done wrong? Tell me, instantly, please, and I'll eat dirt." But she did not quite respond. "Well, you must be really a little more careful in public. You were not quite courteous to me, you know." "Not courteous?" he exclaimed, more amazed than ever. "Let me finish, please. First of all, you contradicted me quite flatly before the others. Then you said that I couldn't see anything in Selva. That was not true. Heavens, let me count 10. She smiled, ever so faintly, lifting her eyes to his, and then dropping them again. "I didn't quite like your tone, you know. And there's something else." "Go on, please. Finish me." Her manner changed a little. She leaned forward, and her tone was less cold. "Neville, dear," she said, "you don't really like Selva, do you? She's really quite common, you know. I cannot understand men. She was one plaster of paint. Her eyes were darkened. Her dress was outrageous. Her manner... Neville, how can you think she's great?" He grinned cheerfully. The crisis was past. "Let's deal with the first," he said. "And may I sit down, please?" He moved towards her, but she made no sign. He went to a chair instead. "First," he said, "you've told me that I wasn't courteous to you. Well, first of all, I apologize abjectly for my ill-bred manner. It was quite unpardonable." Her eyes looked at him again with the dawn of surprise in them. "I was just careless, I suppose. But now, in justice, I must say that it never entered my head that I was being rude, or even careless. I had not, so far as I am aware, the very faintest shadow of irritation or impatience or anything else in my mind. No, let me have my say out, please. That was so, but I do not in the least excuse my brusqueness or rudeness. I am very sorry. I beg your pardon. Please forgive me. I'll try not to do it again." He raised his face to her, brimming with humour and cheerfulness. But to his surprise, there was no humour in her face. She was quite grave. She inclined her head a little, as if to accept his apology in complete seriousness. Well, he must make another attempt. "And for the second point," he said, "I concede to you all that you said about Selva's appearance, the paint, the darkening of the eyes, and I bow to you with regard to her dress, though I must say I can't conceive what you mean. But I was not talking about that sort of thing. I was talking about her genius, and that, with all humility, I still maintain. Why, my dear girl—" He stopped abruptly. She had looked at him again, with such an expression that again with utter bewilderment he perceived that he was on the wrong track. "Oh, dear me, what have I done now?" he cried. "Ah, you don't understand," she said in a low voice. She rose swiftly, he rose with her, really perturbed. She went across to the window and stood there, a slender, graceful silhouette against the brightness. She began to drum gently with her fingers against the pane with her back turned to him. It was very silent here in this room, looking out onto the little gardens at the rear of the flats. A piano sounded faintly from somewhere in the big buildings about them, but so distant that it formed no more than a melodious background. Neville could not conceive what was the matter. It appeared to him that he had blundered frightfully somewhere, but he had no notion in what direction. Had he been clumsy or stupid? Was that it? He was not yet irritated, no more than a bluebottle is irritated for the first instant in which he finds himself hampered by the delicate invisible threads of a newly spun web. Still less was he in the least alarmed. He supposed she would explain presently. She turned round, and, as he looked at her face against the light, there seemed to pass across his eyes just a shred of the film that had darkened them 10 days ago as he came out from the bathing pool in the early morning. Simultaneously, he was aware that the pressure on top of his head was there again, though it was not in the least severe. She began to talk rapidly. "My dear," she said, "I don't want to be disagreeable, but you really are disappointing me a little. I can't conceive how you can think as you do of a woman like that. I should have thought that you'd have seen in an instant what a wretched creature she is. I don't deny her power, of a sort. I've said it again and again, but it's not genius, it's not." She was growing emphatic. "Would you mind sitting down?" said Neville quietly. "I can't see you against the light." She moved away and sat down, without apparently having heard him, and went on. He could see her better now, and her face looked to him quite different. It looked anxious and overwrought. There was none of that fine serenity that he loved so much. He listened, but she repeated herself. She seemed anxious that he should say that the actress had no genius. He grew more and more puzzled. "Let me interrupt a minute," he said. "Is it that you want me to say she isn't a great actress? Well, I can't. I think she is. Ask anyone else you like." She came in passionately. "How can she be a genius? She looks horrible. I can't bear to hear you." Neville stood up. He thought it began to look like hysteria. "My darling, I simply will not discuss Selva any more just now. You're overwrought, and I don't wonder. I've dragged you about too much. Enid, dear." He came across to her as she sat there. He knelt down and took her hands in his. "My darling, I'm a beast and a brute. You must forgive me and make the best of me. Just tell me when I displease you in any way, and—" And I'll do my best to amend. There, we won't talk any more now. You must rest before dinner. We dine at 7, you know. Oh, my dear love. He bent and kissed her hands. She remained passive. Subsection 5. He felt heavy and dispirited as he came out 5 minutes later into the street. He had still plenty of time before he had to go and dress. They were all to go to the theatre again tonight, and he thought that a turn in the park would do him good. There are few places so opulently beautiful as Hyde Park on a summer evening, when the flower beds are so many flaming fires, when from the heavy trees come the cooing of the wood pigeons, when the perfect curved lawns have just been mown once more, and the smell of the cut grass is in the air, when the rhododendrons are out, when there are a few well-mounted riders in the Row, when the carriages and motors go by for their last airing before the twilight closes in, when all this is seen, smelt, and heard under the sunshine of a cloudless June evening. He turned up by the Achilles statue under the trees, and took off his hat as he walked. Already his head felt better, and there was hardly a line of dimness left before his eyes. He was thankful he had not betrayed it just now. It would have distressed Enid terribly. It had come to him as a real relief when he had thought that Enid was a little overwrought. Up to this afternoon, he had known but one side of her, that serene, tranquil mood in which she hated crowds, loved the country, and had understood so perfectly his own attitude to all these things. So she had been in Rome, at Frascati, and at Hartley. Now he had seen another side which he had never suspected. Well, it would make her all the more lovable, no doubt, when he understood it better. As he went up by the side of the water, fervently praying that he might meet no one whom he knew, a number of other little things came back to his mind, each of which, at the time, he had dismissed as irrelevant, but which now, it appeared, had some kind of link one with another, and the explanation of which he began, he thought, to see. The first which he could remember was her gentle fault-finding with him at Hartley. No doubt she had been right in her facts. Masterson was a little familiar sometimes, and Aunt Anna certainly had just a shade of masterfulness. But, in spite of their truth, he had been a little surprised at their being mentioned at all. Then there had been the little affair of Father Richardson. Again, that was a small matter, and she confessed that Neville's own idea had been right, yet certainly she had been rather abrupt with the poor man who, after all, had behaved very nicely to her. Then there was the trifle, he had scarcely thought of it again till now, concerned with the rather sharp words she had spoken to her maid. Well, he hadn't been intended to hear those, yet he had heard them. There they were. Finally, there had been the affair this afternoon. It appeared to him now that these little things were rather significant, not, indeed, of anything serious at all, but just of a tiny fact, that Enid, too, was human, and had her nerves like other people. She was human, but she was none the less lovable. Perhaps even she was more lovable. He knew what nerves were himself. Well, he must remember in future. Then, one by one, a number of other little things floated up, things of which he had thought absolutely nothing at the time, and which, even now, were probably sheer fancies on his own part. There was first her attitude towards her mother. Ah! He remembered now the sharp little things he had heard the girl say to her as he came downstairs one day at Hartley. Well, that fitted in. Again, Mrs. Bessington, at the dinner he had given on his first night in London, had been remarkably lenient towards him in the way of conversation. He had thought it to have been Algy's tact at first, but then she had been really very lenient ever since. Was it conceivable that Enid had, well, given a hint to her mother not to talk so much? A hint? And would a mere hint have stemmed that flowing tide? Again, he had wondered that Enid seemed to have so few friends. At first he had not thought much of it, He had supposed merely that he had not come across them. In fact, he would scarcely have had the chance. Yet, here he had been 10 days in London, and though he had seen various cards in the flat, and had been to a reception or two, the usual friends were singularly lacking. Yet Enid was young and charming and sociable. Perhaps it was Mrs. Bessington's conversation. Certainly she had recognised people at the opera, and they her. And there were Lord Maresfield, and the Heckers, and so on. But where were the rest? Certainly he did not know much about girls and their ways. They were not in his line. He had lived hitherto at Hartley whenever he could. But he had thought, somehow, that they always had plenty of friends. Enid, too, must have met hundreds of women, travelling as she did. Yet again, perhaps it was this very travelling that had hindered intimacies, that, and her dislike of crowds, and her love of solitude. Well, here these facts were, each of them quite minute, quite explicable taken singly, yet together they seemed to point to a strain in her he had not previously recognised, a strain that had shown itself just now in her odd behaviour about Selva, her disappointment that he had not been able to share her view, well, it almost seemed like a curious kind of jealous hypercriticism. He stayed halfway up the walk that ran between the Row and the water. It must be nearly time for him to turn back. A small boy with very fat legs was bent over a little schooner-rigged ship, with an air of very mature seriousness. Something was wrong with the rigging. Neville thought of Jim, and wondered what he was doing. Yes, he must just remember that Enid had nerves. He had been clumsy this afternoon. It had all been his fault. The small boy set the ship firmly back on the edge of the ripple, as if he were planting it. It immediately rocked over onto the tiny beach. And that he must not draw ludicrous deductions from insufficient evidence. He must treat her frankly and courageously, and not inflict his distressing kind of humour on her when she was just a shade on edge. The ship was being pulled about again vehemently. Its owner's face was set in a frown, and his lips were pursed with energy. "What a pity," said Neville. "The bowsprit's come out." The boy looked up at him sharply and appeared satisfied. "Can't I help?" said Neville. The boy moved towards him without embarrassment. "It goes in there, you see," he said seriously. "Do you think you could get it in again?" It was extraordinarily like Jim. That unconventional and unquestioning confidence. Dear Jim. "Yes, I see," he said. "Just hold my stick, will you?"